Simon Powell, who's the global head of thematic research at Jefferies, joining us now. Simon, good afternoon. Thanks a lot for joining us. That's the big word, inflation. And considering what you recently wrote about Gen Z and the focus being on emerging markets, what do you think? What is this big inflation figure? What would it do to emerging markets, the economies, and the markets in general?
Well, thanks for having me on. So we look at demographics. We think demographics is a really important mega trend for investors to focus on. And when I look out long term, I see this as just a temporary inflation scare because demographically, we're going to see population shrink. We're going to see population shrinkage in China, in Japan, it's already started. And so the long-term outlook is inherently deflationary. We have this short-term inflation scare, and the question then becomes, how long does this run for? On the question of Gen Z, the report we've just published, Generation Z is an important cohort of people that investors should be looking at.
All right. So Gen Z offers great potential. I guess, that is the purchasing power that we're looking at in the Indian markets as well, right? Ever since the pandemic, the number of young investors that have entered the market has risen multifold. And that perhaps speaks about why not only have the markets risen, but consumption has picked up in a big way, right, in all of the consumer stocks. Is that the way to approach the market now here in India, Simon? If yes, what are the themes that you're looking at?
So yes, definitely. Gen Z, Indian Gen Z is the biggest single cohort of Gen Z around the world. They are fiscally more responsible than their predecessors. We see that. So that's negative, I think, for the Bitcoin story and crypto, but is positive for housing development. It's positive for autos, it's positive for consumer consumption. What also came through strongly in a survey we did, it's also positive for luxury and premiumization. So investors should be looking at the consumer sector, looking for premium products, premiumizations, higher margins, etc. One also interesting tidbit, Gen Z told us that they're the loneliest cohort ever, which kind of makes sense because families have been shrinking in terms of family size. And there's a strong read through for pet ownership. They want to own pets.
Okay. So in that case, premiumization is a theme that, Gen Z could actually give a fillip to. But does that also mean there are certain sectors or certain consumption patterns which will not see the growth that earlier or the millennial generation saw? See something like buying homes or buying cars for that matter. Do you think those are the sectors where you'll not see a lot of consumption?
On the autos, the jury's out because the question is, do Gen Z want to own cars and drive cars? And we see shrinkage in driver license numbers globally, and we probably will see the same thing from India point of view. But as I said, fiscally responsible, so we're going to see them invest more money than the previous cohort did and potentially invest more in property. So I think on the negative side, student loans, we're going to see a reduction in student loans globally. Gen Z is less inclined to take out student loans for education, less inclined to take out payday loans and, short-term finance that might be squeezed. So those are the things that could be negatively impacted.
Okay, I like the way you said, Simon, that Gen Z is only interested in having pets. No one wants to have kids anymore. As they say, right, pets are the new kids and plants are the new pets. So I guess you've got to live with that. But how does one capitalize on this move, especially in a market like India? Because there's so much disruption happening every day, right? Whether you talk about fintech, you talk about electric vehicles, there's renewable energy. And the new generation, which is 25% of the population, as you said, the spending population, is interested in these new themes. So what would you pick from a long-term investor standpoint?
Look, long-term, I think tech is still somewhere to be because remember, this is a generation that has grown up with Google. I mean, Google came to existence around '97 when this generation started being born. So they are absolutely connected full-time. So tech, I think, should still have a big focus. I think also people should really think about the inherited wealth that this generation is going to acquire. And it depends on what government does with inheritance taxes and so on. But we're going to see probably the biggest ever transfer of wealth from the boomers to the Gen Zs, and it might skip the millennials. And, that's going to be significant. Their earning power is going to go up. So a large cohort of people standing to inherit a lot of money, good spending power. I'd be focused on luxury because they tell us that they do want to buy luxury goods. So I think the read-through for luxury is high. They want quality and they're fiscally responsible. So investors need to factor those three things in.
So how would you play the emerging market theme in that case? If we talk about other emerging markets, is there anything other than India that you would like, and generally specific themes that you would look at?
Yeah, look, so as we said in our report, almost 90% of Gen Z is in emerging or frontier markets. So obviously India, China, but then you should look at Indonesia, you should look at Mexico, you should look at some of the LATAM stories to see those big populations of Gen Z, because what you're looking for is low, medium age across that population. In terms of those themes, the ones I described, so look at tech, look at consumer, but premium consumer, and look for some degree of national identity. So we've seen this strongly in China. Chinese Gen Z consumers switching to consume Chinese products. So there's some nationalism in there as well. What I would say is a rotation out of China and into India, which has clearly worked over the last year, should continue to work because demographically, India is in a much better place than China.
So what do you do, Simon, with some of the old economy stocks and sectors, right? Whether it's the traditional banks that are getting disrupted by fintech companies, whether it's the traditional ICE engine automakers that have been doing well for a very long time, but now getting hit by electric vehicles. Do you move them out of your portfolio, or do you, keep the faith there?
I don't think you move them out of your portfolio altogether, but you recognize that these companies are going to have to live with a lower top line and therefore bottom line growth number. So you ask the question, is that lower growth outlook in the price already? If it is, then you can continue to hold. But if it's not in the price, then potentially you trim your exposure. You raise an interesting point about, developed markets. The outlook demographically for places like Italy, places like Germany, and is not great. And so investors need to be factoring in lower top line growth across all sectors as a result of the demographic outlook.
Okay, but India in that case tends to benefit according to you. Okay, so
absolutely, yes, right spot.
So in that case, that is a longer term scenario, right? That shift that we are talking about, consumption patterns. In the medium term, what is the outlook on emerging markets, considering whatever is happening? You said inflation is also going to be a transitory thing. So in the longer term, do you think deflation could be an issue?
Deflation is going to become an issue for China, if you think about it from an emerging markets point of view. China's got a real problem. It's going to, if we look forward, it's going to behave very much like Japan from a deflation point of view. But that's a long-term story. In the short term, in the short to medium term, from an emerging markets point of view, I would think that inflation in emerging markets potentially might not be as high as we've seen in developed markets. And I think that's probably reflected in what the Indian market's doing at the moment. So it's going to be imported inflation probably from the energy crisis and probably some imported food inflation. But I don't think there's a major issue. I do see India as a bright spot demographically. And that's the key takeaway.
All right. Well, India is a bright spot. That's on that optimistic note, Simon, we'll end this conversation. Thanks a lot for joining in.